Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Kara Circle. Kara Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Karis Books, and Karis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're very excited to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate Being Ace, an anthology of queer, trans, femme, and disabled stories of asexual love and connection. This is a reading and panel discussion featuring Madeline Dyer, SE or Sarah Anderson, Rosie Thor, Moniza Hussein, and Lara Amin. This book invites you to discover the infinite realms of asexual love across sci-fi, fantasy, and contemporary stories. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Gay Johnson McDougall Center for Global Diversity and Inclusion. It is part of the Division of Equity and Inclusion at Agnes Scott College, and it is committed to fostering a community that celebrates and honors the intersections of identity. And so this is part of our broader, October is Pride Month in Georgia, and so we get to celebrate Pride twice because we do also still celebrate it in June. This is part of our larger LGBTQIA celebration, and the A for some people means ally, the A for some people means ace. We just are happy to welcome anyone into the broader Pride umbrella who wants to be there. So we recognize that people have many identities that intersect and sometimes bounce off each other in interesting ways, and that's sort of the spirit of tonight. I am not going to go too deeply into anyone's story because they are all going to do that themselves. But I'm very happy that you are all here tonight. I know there was a lot of excitement about ACE representation sort of finally moving into more mainstream culture, from sex education to, other, from Heartbreaker, like several recent YA events and TV shows. But there needs to be much more. So congratulations to all of you for this important book. And we're so glad you're here. And I want to encourage folks who would like to ask a question, feel free to put it in the chat or in the Q&A box at any time. And when the time comes, Madeline will help us bring your questions into the virtual room. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Madeline, and then we will get right into it. But thank you all so much for being with us.
Yeah, so thank you. I'm so excited to be here with you all, and we're discussing our new book, which is so exciting. So first of all, I'll just get everyone to introduce themselves just so that all our audience know who we are. So Lara, would you like to go first with introducing yourself and give us a little description about your story?
Okay, yeah, my name is Lara. My story is a YA thriller, and it's called The Hazards of Pressing Play. And it's about a asexual wheelchair user with cerebral palsy who has 48 hours to save her girlfriend from an anonymous enemy. And that is the basic pitch for that story. Really excited to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, your story is great. It's so tense and thrilling, and I loved it so much. So yeah, we'll be talking about that a bit more. Sarah, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm S.E. Anderson, also Sarah. I'm an astrophysicist by day and a writer by night, or the other way around, depending on the telescopes. And my story is Smells Like Teen Virgin, which takes apart the purity myth as our young, intrepid slayer, Artemis, reeks of virginity, and that's attracting monsters. And in order for her to embrace her calling as a slayer, she needs to get rid of that smell. And unfortunately, with asexuality, that doesn't make things very easy.
Yeah, I mean, she's definitely got quite a challenge there. Yeah, Rosie, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I am Rosie Thor. I'm the author of Tarnished Are the Stars, Fire Becomes Her, The Meaning of Pride, and Life is Strange Steph Story, and also a story in this anthology called Well Suited. It is about a young woman whose family has just been elevated to the status of knighthood, and she has to come out to society at a coming out ball. And she's ace, and that's horrifying to her. So she enlists her best friend, a non-binary wizard who works in the kitchens, to enchant a suit of armor to be her escort. Only the suit of armor has other ideas and patriarchal ideas that they have to dismantle and potentially sword fight.
Yeah, I mean, I love the fun aspects in your story so much. It's just brilliant. And finally, Moniza, would you like to introduce yourself and your story?
Hi, my name is Moniza Hussain. My story is The Mermaid Sister, and it's a retelling of The Little Mermaid. And it's basically a kind of retelling that focuses on the relationship between the Little Mermaid and her sister, as opposed to the romantic relationship that's at the center of the original story. And I wanted to write it just because I feel like there should be more focus on other kinds of love. And yeah, that's what the story is about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I love your story too. I particularly love the world building in your story as well. Yeah, and for those who don't know me, I'm Madeline Dyer. I'm a writer, editor, and anthologist. My short story in this anthology is called Nylon Bed Socks, and it's a narrative verse story about a girl who is coming to terms with things that have happened to her that are quite traumatic and understanding who she is and discovering her identity. So yeah, obviously between the five of us, we cover many different sub-identities within the ace spectrum. And of course, it's important to show that there's no one way to be ace. So I think that in our anthology, we do a great job of showing that. And yeah, I am curious, what made you write your ace character in that specific way? So was this an intentional decision on your part, or did you just write and see where the character took you? And Moniza, we'll start with you this time.
I'm so sorry, my dog is about to bark. Could you repeat the question? I'm so sorry. My dog is acting up.
Sure. So we're just talking about what made you write your ace character in that specific way, whether it was an intentional decision or whether you just wrote and saw where the character took you.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah. So basically, I read the Hans Christian Andersen story at like a very impressionable age when I was very young. I read the unabridged version, and I remember like it had like an illustration of the Little Mermaid turning to foam at the end when she dies and she throws herself into the sea. And it was really traumatizing. And it's a story that had a grip on me and still does to this day. I just wanted to like rewrite that story where she wasn't driven so entirely by romantic love and where the focus was more on the sibling relationship. So that's why I felt like she had to be Arrow as well as Ace. She could have been, you know, aromantic, but I felt like the story really needed her to be Arrow. And I also feel like there are a lot of fairy tales where the focus is on romantic love. So I felt like this one would be better if it was just a different type of fairy tale, you know, because there's so many of the other kinds. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely makes sense. And Rosie, what about you?
Yeah, so I also went for characters who are aromantic and asexual. It was really important to me in this story because the villain was the genesis of the story, and that is the suit of armor that comes to life and is this kind of avatar of patriarchal, heteronormative ideals. And I knew that I wanted to counter that with a queer platonic partnership and queer platonic pining. And so I built this story to be kind of follow the beats of a romantic storyline, but with a platonic center. And so I have my two characters, Brindle and Fig, are both aromantic, asexual, and they kind of come into this situation recognizing that within each other without really ever having a strong discussion about it. And I thought that that was a fun way to kind of go at it with two people who are so alike and so strongly relate to each other without having specific labels attached to them and describing specifically more their feelings. And I would call them both aromantic, asexual, but they don't ever discuss that on the page. And I thought it was a fun way to deal with that in a sort of medieval setting where, I didn't know if I wanted to introduce the vocabulary. So they really do get into it, deep into the discussion of like how they feel and what they feel for each other But at the center of all of that is this horrifying, like life-size suit of armor that is trying to force them to be hetero and allonormative.
Yeah, I mean, that was one thing I really appreciated about your story, in that they never actually come out and say which labels they use for themselves, but it is very clear to readers which sort of way that they are coded as being ace and aro. So yeah, that was really well done. Sarah, how about you?
Yeah, so I decided to start with what I knew and brought myself back to me back when I was a teenager and how I was feeling. And unfortunately, Artemis, unlike me, who had the time and space to explore my identity, and I'm still questioning parts of it, well, she is in a rush. She doesn't have the space, she doesn't have the environment where she can understand what she is, figure out the label that fits her. So she is, in short, on paper, we know that she is sex repulsed ace. I know if she's aromantic, asexual, demi, and all that, that's in my head, but she doesn't know that yet. She's still trying to work that out. And unfortunately, because of the pressures of her family and her environment, she does not yet have the space to find those labels for herself. But that's what she is, at least in the story when you meet her.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and I do think it's really important that we have characters that are still like questioning whereabouts they fall on the ace spectrum. So that's something that my character does in my story as well, and it's just a good way, I think, of relating to a lot of readers as well who might be at that stage where they're not sure what exactly their identity is. So Lara, how about you with creating your characters?
Oh my gosh, so my story is quite a journey. I started writing this story in 2019, and I was approached by an author friend of mine, Dana Melee, who writes thrillers, and she's like, I have this idea for a, sci-fi thriller anthology. Do you want to be part of it? And I said, yes. And the idea for this anthology died on submission, but I pitched, the idea was a sci-fi thriller idea about a disabled vigilante who, it was kind of the same thing, same story, but it had more techie aspects, like it had a real sci-fi angle to it using technology and stuff. It was very Black Mirror. So I was like, okay, I'm going to write this story. And then I ended up not writing it because the anthology died on submission. So she said, oh, well, you still have, this idea and this pitch for the story. So when this anthology came up, I said, okay, how about this pitch? And I didn't know the time at which she would be, like, explicitly ace. Like, I knew she was disabled, but I didn't know she would be explicitly ace. But it fit for the story, and it ended up being a more contemporary thriller. And I was also influenced at the time. I'm also a screenwriter, so at the time I had written a TV pilot about a group of disabled vigilantes who take down a eugenics institution. It's really intense. I'm not working on that story anymore, but some germ of that idea bled its way into the short story, even though it's YA. And that kind of, between that idea and the sci-fi idea becoming like a contemporary thriller, it kind of just merged into like this one idea, and that's how I came up with that character. And her name, Violet, actually comes from the pilot that I wrote. The main character's name was Violet. And I said, well, if I'm not writing that pilot anymore, maybe I'll just use that character's name and we'll have part of the story carry over. So that's how I came up with that character. And I wanted to see more disabled asexual characters also in fiction, because it ends up becoming like a stereotype. Because like people will say, oh, if you're disabled and asexual, like there must be something wrong, with you. So that's how I kind of came up with that idea. It was like a mix of things.
Wow, that's so interesting, and I love like hearing the background of stories and how we put them together and sort of just the inside information. It's so interesting. And of course, we also cover many different genres and themes and tones between us and with the other stories in the anthology too. So I just wanted to ask you, what excites you most about having a multi-genre ace anthology? Rosie, would you like to go first with this one?
I would love to go first for this one. I think it's so cool to see asexual representation in so many different genres. I obviously, like, I write science fiction and fantasy, and so I do see it in those spaces, but I do think we see a much more, this is going to sound a little bit odd, but there is a willingness to accept asexuality as a plot point in a contemporary story of, you know, coming out or something like that. And in science fiction and fantasy, in my experience, it's often kind of sidelined. It becomes this thing that's like, why is that important to the story? And it's like, well, because it's important to the character. It's just who they are. And they want it to serve some sort of plot purpose or something. And this anthology, I think, really gave many of us an opportunity to explore a genre or a type of storytelling that we might not have otherwise pursued. I know that there are some really amazing science fiction stories in the anthology that I love. Akemi Dawn Bowman's Across the Stars is one of my favorites in the anthology. And I also absolutely love The Third Star Boat by Roanna Silver. And so we really get to dive into so many different genres. And that gives, I think, an opportunity for us to write stories that speak to different tropes and different audiences. Sarah's story in particular, I think really just takes on the sort of teen paranormal genre in a way that's really interesting. It's so Buffy the Vampire Slayer, like in its energy. I'm sorry, my cat has come to visit. She too thinks that multi-genre stories for asexual characters are good. But it's something that I think across the board, we need more ace stories in every genre. And this is a really wonderful kind of sampling of different stories. There's going to be something in the anthology for everyone.
Yeah. So, Sarah, would you like to tell us what excites you most about having a multi-genre ace anthology as well? Oh, I cannot hear you, Sarah.
Oh, she's muted.
Sorry, I muted the mic because my cat was making noise. Lovely. But I just don't know how I can come up after that amazing answer. Rosie hit the nail on the head right there. I'm just like her. So, Ben, sorry, I missed your pronouns.
It's cool. I use both.
Okay, cool. Yes, so I'm just so excited that there's a little bit for everyone. Everyone's going to be able to see themselves, maybe, hopefully, because, I mean, come on. How many of us, when we were this age, had an ace character in a genre that we loved? I mean, I think the first time I saw someone who was openly ace on TV, it was a cartoon character. It's Todd from BoJack Horseman. That was the first time I saw that kind of character. I don't remember. When it came to YA books, it might have been in the Gentleman's Guide to Piracy series. I mean, I didn't get that when I was a kid, teen, anything, maybe until my 20s. So I'm just hoping that people will have something that they'll enjoy, whether they be ace or not. They can either see themselves in these pages or just enjoy a great story. Whatever their cup of tea is, they're going to find something.
Definitely, yeah. So, I mean, these answers have covered a bit about why ace representation is so important. So perhaps we can delve a bit deeper into that and talk about ace representation in popular culture in general and how maybe it's changed recently and hopefully how being ace is going to be contributing towards this movement. So Manisha, would you like to start us off on this topic?
I think like the most recent example of someone ace I've seen on any kind of media is actually Heartstopper. It's so sad that it's this. Yeah, it took that long for me to see something. That's why I think it's so important to have something that can be in libraries, in schools, so that kids can see themselves represented and maybe have some sort of understanding of what it is that they are. And I love the variety in this book because, it's such a huge spectrum. So it's like really helpful because if you feel like you are one specific thing, you know, like you can see that, oh, no, actually, you don't have to be pigeonholed in quite such a specific way. You can be allo in one way and still be, you know, ace in other ways. And that's what I really appreciate about this anthology. Yeah.
Yeah, we're definitely showing that it is a spectrum and emphasizing the importance of showing all these different ways that identities can form and interact, and what they mean for a person might not mean exactly the same for another ace person as well, which I think is so important. So Lara, would you like to talk a bit about ace representation in popular culture?
I was really moved by Cody's essay in the beginning. I think it was Cody's in the beginning of the anthology, because he talked about the importance of representation, not just ace representation, but, you know, he started talking broadly about queer representation and then ace representation, and how, you know, when he was a kid, he didn't see that. And I think that that was such an important introduction to our anthology and to, you know, introducing all of our stories. And it was just, I don't know, there was something about that essay that was so, as someone who, I study disability representation in my PhD, I just got my PhD, and as someone who like studies representation and studies it, to read an essay that opens like that is amazing. One example of ace representation that really sticks out for me, again going with disability representation, is the show Everything's Gonna Be Okay on Freeform. It's about, there's 2 or 3 autistic characters, and they explicitly say in the show that they are asexual, and it's a really interesting show. It was on for 2 seasons, and that was the first time that I had seen like ace and disability representation together, and it was portrayed in a way that was, you know, conforming and, you know, positive and very affirming, and in a way like how all of our stories are. And it was just so nice to see that as an example of representation. I haven't seen Heartstopper yet, but I remember seeing that and just feeling like, oh, they actually had conversations about being ace and how important that is, especially when you're disabled or when, you know, you come from other backgrounds. And I think that's really important. So if, you know, TV shows like that and books like ours are having those conversations, I think it's sort of you're slowly starting to see like, oh, there are these representations, and people do want to see, you know, like ace representations from all kinds of genres and backgrounds. And
definitely, yeah, because there's just something so empowering, isn't there, when you read a character and you can see yourself on the page. Because thinking back to when I was a teenager, I don't think I actually read any stories with ace characters. And I just think if I had, it would have been an amazing experience, and just being this extra way that I could relate to a character and know almost like I wasn't alone and there were other people feeling the same way that I was. So yeah, I mean, let's talk next about what the most exciting things about having an ace anthology created by ace writers is. So, Sarah, would you like to kick us off on this one?
Oh, just, you know, representation by the people who need to be represented. Wow, sorry, it is midnight here and my brain is starting to feel it. Actually, it's 1 a.m. now. But yes, I think that's just the short of it. We need to see more of ourselves in fiction written by people who know what it's like to be ace. I mean, right now, there's all this discourse going on about the last season of Sex Education, where we had a character that was written, well, at least a lot of information was given by Yasmine Benoit, a very prominent asexual, outspoken, wow, I'm forgetting my vocabulary. Yes. So she worked very hard on creating this character. And unfortunately, because she wasn't constantly in the writing room, a lot of things got left off on the editing floor. And the representation, unfortunately, didn't come through with the way that she wanted it to. And it's a bit painful to see. And that's the hard thing, that, you know, as hard as we try, if we're not there every step of the process, there's going to be parts of our representation, parts of our identities that won't get shared, won't get transmitted. And so being able from start to finish be in charge of our narratives, I think that was really powerful.
Yeah, what a great answer. Manisa, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. I was thinking about like, so before Heartstopper, I think the closest thing I had to something I'd seen where it was like ace representation was The Big Bang Theory. But it wasn't ace representation at all. I don't know what it was. It was horrible. It was like almost ace, but not really. It's like the butt of a joke. So yeah, I mean, Heartstopper is great. I watched that and it made me cry because I felt like I found a character who was so incredibly relatable to me. But what's great about our book is that we've got a variety of different writers, and you all come from such different backgrounds, and there's so much intersectionality in this book. So, you know, it doesn't have to be just this one specific type of person. It's just so many different varieties of us, and we all get to share our point of view. So yeah, I mean, it's just such a powerful book, and I'm so glad it gets to exist. I'm so proud to be part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I am so happy to have worked with all of you. And yeah, just sort of like building off of that. So there's been a lot of discourse recently, obviously, in the publishing industry about who should be allowed to write stories where the identity might not be your own. So obviously we've created this Ace Anthology by Ace writers, but what are your views on allo writers and non-Ace people if they want to write an Ace character? So what advice would you have in that regard? What about you, Rosie?
So I feel like, you know, there's a lot of nuance within that conversation, and I think it is different depending on what identity you're talking about. There are certain identities that, you know, it's like, you know, there are certain times when it really isn't your story to tell. And I think that when it comes to representation of asexuality, which is what I feel I can speak toward, I feel like it's important for allo writers to understand that writing an asexual character is a wonderful thing, and that them doing that can be a wonderful thing, and it can be wonderful representation. I would caution against an allo writer choosing to write a story that centers on ace oppression, because that really isn't their story to tell. You know, writing a story that includes asexual characters, very good. Very happy to see that kind of representation. In fact, as we were talking about it before, everyone was kind of chiming in with the first time they saw asexual representation. And the first time I saw it was actually quite a long time ago. I was young, and it is surprising that it didn't have more of an impact on me until much later. But it was Sandry from the Circle of Magic series by Tamora Pierce. I know, and she is asexual, and it takes a while to build, but that's, I think, really important representation. I don't pretend to know how Tamora Pierce identifies, but I do think that has power, and including a diverse world of people with different sexualities that exist in different intersections of identity, I think is our job as writers, no matter where we come from or, you know, what identity we label ourselves as. And I do think that we have a responsibility to reflect a diverse world of different people experiencing different sexualities and different experiences with relationships. But I also think that we have a responsibility to our readers to ensure that we are representing those identities in a responsible and respectful way, even when we share that identity. So even as an ace person writing ace stories, I often consult other ace friends and ask them, hey, does this seem okay? What do you think about this? Am I subverting this trope well, or am I just confirming the trope and making it worse? So it's, I think, important at all times to be in discussion with community. And if you do not have community within that identity, then I think that speaks to a larger issue of this really isn't your lane. You know, if you're not in community with the people that you're trying to represent, then you don't really have any business doing that, in my opinion. So
yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And this leads perfectly on to the question that I'd like to ask you, Lara, because obviously I know that you're an academic within disability studies and you also do sensitivity reading. So what kind of advice would you give to people that maybe they want to write an ace character and they want to do it in an authentic way, but they're not quite sure like where to start Do you have any pointers or advice for them?
I think, because I've been asked like variations of this question before, and I think I'm not comfortable with people who don't have like that. If they're figuring out their identity, like that's another thing. Like I can't stop people from like, if you're figuring out your identity and you want to write a main character with that identity while you're figuring it out, like go for it. Like I'm not, but if you come from if you're writing an identity that isn't your own and you're writing that as the main character, like ask yourself why you want to write that story, because it's probably not your story to tell. If you want to write it as a side character or a minor character, that's okay. Like I have plenty of, side characters that don't share, my, marginalizations or whatever. But I want to make sure that, because I am also a sensitivity reader, I want to make sure that like when if I do get that work published in the future, something that I do consult the right people. So I think that if someone who is an ace wants to write an ace character, you have to put in the work to know how to like do the research. And also, if you're going to want to write a main character, like ask yourself, like, is this really my story to tell? Because you come from a different experience and a different lens of experience, it might be better for someone else to tell the story, but maybe they could take like your minor character and make them ace or a side character and still have some kind of impact, and then get input from sensitivity readers, or like Rosie was saying, like people who are also part of their, if they check in with other people who are from their marginalization, but they're just like checking in. But if they're not from that identity, then I don't think they should be writing like the main character, especially like if it comes from a place of oppression or pain or something, or trauma. But if they want to write like a side character or a minor character, I think that's totally fine. And, we welcome people who want to write different types of characters all the time. And that's why sensitivity readers get hired, because, we want to that hiring a sensitivity reader also doesn't mean that like, just because one sensitivity reader says, okay, this is okay, maybe if another sensitivity reader read it, they might not think so. So like everyone's still going to come with their own lens of opinion. So like that's important too. It's not like, oh, I just hired one sensitivity reader and I'm fine. Like you still have to put in the work to like look to different types of people and different experiences and different lens of experiences. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. I mean, that is such a good point, because obviously there is always going to be a degree of subjectivity when any sensitivity reader is assessing a manuscript. And our job as a writer is to write something and like produce something that does not perpetuate harm, or like perpetuates the least amount of harm. And it's a social duty that we have, like, and I think it's so important in young adult fiction, especially. So
do you mind if I add to that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I just want to add to something that Lara said that I really thought was kind of poignant. You're talking about this exploration. And I think that writing as exploration is really powerful. And we often, when we're having discussions like this, I think we often put the focus on publishing. And there's a difference between writing a story and publishing a story. And I just want to encourage anyone who's watching who is feeling trepidatious about writing ace characters. If you're unsure if you identify as ace, or you really don't know and you feel compelled to write an ace character, I would encourage you to do that, because there's a lot of steps that go between writing a first draft and then publishing your novel. And just to share some of my own experience in that space, I didn't know that I was asexual before I published my first book, Tarnished Are the Stars, which one of the main characters in that book is aromantic asexual. And as I was writing the story, I learned that he was aromantic asexual, and then realized, oh wait, so am I. And it was sort of that like Spider-Man meme, like, oh, we're both dressed the same. And allowing the writing process to be part of your self-discovery is a really powerful thing. And I think a really important step for any writer who is questioning their identity. So I just don't want you to feel afraid to explore that. there are always opportunities to change the story if you need to. If you get to a certain place and you're like, this really isn't my story to tell and it's not me, you can change it, and that's okay. You have still grown as a writer, and the time that you spent writing that story is not wasted. So, and then on the flip side, you might, sit down to write this character that you're not sure how much you identify with, and then discover things about yourself, and that's magic. So, just give yourself the grace to try something and know that you don't have to commit to it if you don't want to. It's not final until you send that draft that's like draft _final_final_ really it's final. You're okay.
Can I add an anecdote to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I also found out I'm asexual from writing a manuscript that is not published. It was something I wrote when I was 15 or 16. And all my beta readers were saying, are these characters asexual? And I was like, what's that? Boom, started a whole line of questioning, and look where I am now.
I mean, yeah, like I also had a similar experience. So now I'm kind of intrigued, like, is there something that a lot of ace people experienced, almost because there's like this lack of representation of ace characters in popular culture that we grew up with, where this sort of awareness of it just wasn't around us. So yeah, I mean, that again just shows the importance of raising awareness of asexuality, of course. So yeah, just as a reminder, if you're watching this right now, you can directly interact with us, asking us some questions. We'll be happy to answer. I can see we've got a nice little discussion going in the chat at the moment, and Sarah has put a very important thing in here about, I would say ally writers should be careful about avoiding the right person changing any aspect of the ace character, even if it's approached without malignant intentions. It's a delicate thing that ace folks navigate in a way that allies might not think about. And yeah, that is so important, because there is this idea in a lot of people and societies and ideologies that asexuality is something that needs to be cured, or that it's a problem, or it's often pathologized as well a lot in medical industries. And we don't want to be reinforcing that incorrect belief about asexuality. And of course, an ally writer might not be aware of the nuances within sort of those discussions. So yeah, I mean, Manisa, is there anything that you would sort of like to add to this discussion about this?
I had something to say previously about writing from a perspective that may not be your own. I think this discussion gets really complicated because sometimes it's about identities like race, and then other times it's about sexuality. And I feel like it's not helpful to confound the two, because when it comes to something like race, you know what your race is. If you're writing from another perspective, by all means, go ahead and do it. But you have to do the research, because if you don't, it's really, really obvious. And that goes for like minor characters as well. Like I've read books where there might be a character who's South Asian, but then there are a lot of nuances within South Asian cultures. And if you don't do the modicum of research required, it's instantly obvious to someone who is South Asian that you don't know anything about these people. So you need to do that research right away. But then when you're talking about sexuality, when you're writing in the process, you can discover, oh, hang on, there's a reason why I keep writing this particular. Is it because I am it? Why do I? Oh, wait, hang on. So that happens a lot more with sexuality, I think. Like if you're drawn to a specific kind of character and you keep wanting to write from that perspective, it could be that maybe you are, in some ways, there's somewhere the part of you that really relates to it. So yeah, I think that's something that people need to be mindful of. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for adding that in, because you're right that there are quite a lot of complexities to do with different identities and the writing of different identities, especially if we're not a writer that identifies in the same way. Yeah, I mean, Rosie, I saw you nodding away when I was speaking then about previously about Sarah's point in the discussion about avoiding the idea of the right person being able to change someone's asexuality. So is there anything that you wanted to add on that?
Absolutely. I think that there are a lot of specific tropes and pitfalls that we often see in asexual representation that is done either from a perspective that is not ace, or just from a perspective of ignorance of the damage of some of the tropes. And I think that's one of them. The right person. It's called allo for you, and the idea being, I think, in that is that some people just don't understand that there's multiple identities at play under the A label. We have asexuality, we have aromanticism, and not everyone who is asexual is also going to be aromantic. So just because someone who is asexual is in a relationship with someone does not mean that they are allo for that one person. We also will see a lot of differences in terms of experience of asexuality. Not every ace person is sex repulsed. Not every ace person is sex averse. Some ace people are into kink. Some ace people are into all kinds of things. And it's about the attraction. It's about experiencing or not sexual attraction. And that's something that I think a lot of people miss when they're dealing with an ace character. They think because this person is married, or because they enter into a relationship with another character that includes some kind of sexual component, that they're not actually ace. They attribute celibacy to asexuality rather than understanding that asexuality is like any other sexuality. It's an attraction model. It's not about action. It's about how you feel, not about what you do. And so I think that that's probably where that comes from. There's a lot of other tropes that I think fall into those spaces that occasionally get kind of, they often get used and not interrogated, I think. So we see things like the trope of asexual characters who are linked to death. And I think that there's a story in the anthology that kind of interrogates this a little bit, which is Lindsay Miller's Give Up the Ghost. And the character is ace and also is like a tour guide for a haunted cemetery. And people assume that she has this power because she is asexual and because she's dead inside, essentially. And that's not the case. And that comes out in the story a little bit. And there's a discussion of that, which I think is really powerful. So there's all kinds of ways to interact with tropes like that. But I think we have to interrogate them properly if we're going to do that. We can't just put the trope on display and assume that that's enough. We have to talk about it and kind of engage with it in a different way if we're going to examine some of those tropes that have historically been kind of acephobic. The same thing is true for like the asexual alien race, or like we'll see that as like oftentimes we see asexuality and disability conflated as well as like, oh, you have to be both, and that's not the case. So there's a lot of different tropes that we see used routinely that can get a little bit tiresome for those of us who have read a lot in the space. But there are ways to do all of those tropes in a way that is effective and affirming rather than kind of harmful. So I do think that like that's a trope that we do see a lot of the time, and I think that it can be utilized in an effective way. I don't know that I have seen it used in an effective way recently. I can't come up with an example, but that's kind of how I feel about all of those. Like, don't do X ever kind of discussions about tropes within asexuality. I think that in the hands of an ace person who knows the trope well and understands the pitfalls, it can be really powerful.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with that. And just the idea of like interrogating the tropes as well. And like Sarah, I feel that's something you do really well in your story. Particularly when you've got the two sisters who are both asexual, and we're showing the ways that they're experiencing their asexuality quite differently to each other. Would you like to talk a bit about that?
Well, that just comes from natural conversations that, I mean, I've had, you've probably all had, where you're just like, what am I? What am I feeling? As you mentioned earlier, Rosie, some people end up in relationships that from the outside look hetero. I'm married to a man, and people ask questions, and I actually went through a long period wondering if it invalidated my identity because I was married to a dude. And I had to process that and have these discussions with other people and trying to understand, does the label change just because other labels in my life have changed? And also the whole question of, now this is something, okay, I don't want to go too deep into it because otherwise I'm sure we can go off on a tangent. Being demi, you don't know if you're demi until you get that feeling. And I still don't know if technically I'm demi, gray, but heck, married, whatever, not going into any details there. But it's one of those things that some people, it's a trope that I'm afraid of seeing or using, of a person, again, waiting for the right person, and boom, I'm demi. I'm okay. And I find that as a very damaging trope because there's nothing wrong with you in the first place, first of all. And I've had so many conversations with people about this, and just, wait for the right person to come along. That was what I heard for so many years. And it really had me questioning my own identity over and over and over again because of these conversations. So I wanted to have these two sisters just outright finally have the time and the space to think about this, even though it is, I wish I could have gone way longer. It could have been a whole chapter in a book if we really wanted to go into it, or a whole book in itself, because I feel like many of us have had very long conversations with many different people and have many different feelings coming out of those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And again, it's just showing the importance of having characters that represent ourselves in fiction. And I particularly liked what you were saying about labels and like when you're not entirely sure what label applies to you, because again, it just shows the limitations of labels. Like I always think of labels like they are only helpful until they're not helpful. And we can change the labels that we identify with. If there's another label that might be more helpful and applicable to us, then we can use that label instead. And it doesn't invalidate us at all if we do find that there is a label that actually fits us a little bit better. So yeah, we've also got a discussion going on in the chat. So there's also the problem of people being forced to come out before they're ready because people feel like someone has to prove that they get or are allowed to write asexuality, that someone doesn't think they fit the mold of. So obviously when we are looking at being ace, it's pretty common knowledge among us all that we are ace creators writing these ace characters. So Lara, what are your thoughts on people feeling like they are writing an ace character who's very similar to themselves, but they then feel the need to come out to almost prove that their depiction of the character is valid?
I think that's such a hard question because, like, we all have, like, I don't like the idea that people should feel pressured to come out. Like, I don't think if people, should have their own, like, whatever the process they go through, like, should be individual to themselves. So I don't feel like, I feel like they shouldn't be, like, pressured, and they should, if they want to, great. If not, but I know sometimes people don't have that. Like, it's very varied. So I just don't like the idea of people feeling any kind of pressure to, like, perform an identity. I don't think that's that makes me uncomfortable because, like, we're all discovering different stuff about different parts of our identity. It might not be asexuality, it might be something else. Like, I discovered another part of, like, my identity. It wasn't asexuality, but it was something else. But, like, it took me a while to, like, process that. Like, we all have our own things, and, like, we shouldn't feel forced to, and we shouldn't feel the need to, like, perform something just because we're writing a character about it. Like, and that's why writing can be a way to process, those feelings about, like, I was feeling very similarly to Sarah and to Madeline, we were saying earlier about, like, using writing to process, like, feelings about being queer or ace or whatever, because I kind of went through something similar in my writing as well when I was writing something for a friend of mine, and I was writing this character, and I realized, like, oh, I might be writing this character because I feel this way, but, like, I didn't realize it until I was already writing it. But sometimes that happens, and sometimes it happens in other ways.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's always something quite innately therapeutic about writing, and about writing characters that are very close and similar to ourselves. I mean, a lot of my narratives that I write are quite trauma-based, and I was quite aware that when I was writing a story that touched on trauma and a story that also has an ace character, but I didn't want to conflate the two and like add to the trope or stereotype that if you're ace, it's because of trauma. But at the same time, there are some people out there that are going to be ace and have experienced trauma, whether or not it did contribute to their asexuality. And for me, just writing that story, I found that so therapeutic. And for a long time, like, I'd written the story and I almost didn't want to share it to anyone because it felt too close and too personal to me. And like, if I put the story out there, I was almost like opening up this private part of myself to the world. So what advice would you have for people that are writing these really personal stories that they feel compelled to write because it helps heal them, but at the same time they're a bit worried and a bit anxious maybe about putting themselves on display in this way? And I'll just open this question up for any of you who would like to jump in to answer this.
I definitely can. And I would speak from a place of experience here, in deciding what stories are for the public to consume and what stories are not. And there's a lot of myself in my books. There's a lot of myself in the story in this anthology. And I think that people who know me will read them and get to know another piece of me that they might not have known or see pieces of me in them. But there's always going to be things that I choose to hold back. And that's because the art that I'm creating and the product that I'm selling is not the same as who I am as a person. I am not for sale. I am not for consumption. And I find, for me at least, it's really important to hold some of those things back, to have some things that are not, they're not things that I share on social media. There are some things that I do not share in my work, and that's because they're for me and my family and my friends and not for my readers. And there are some things that I will put in my books for my readers that I probably don't really share with the people who are closest to me sometimes, because it's a weird sort of balance. And so I think that the advice that I have for anyone who is feeling that sort of trepidation over the idea of sharing something that is very personal is, you have to ask yourself, and the answer is going to be different for everyone. There is no one size fits all for this. But I do think it's important for you to ask if you are anxious about sharing it because you're nervous about the reception, or if you're anxious about sharing it because you're nervous about revealing part of yourself that you're not ready to reveal. If you're worried about reception, I think that that's something that all writers experience no matter what. We are always worried about what people are going to think of our work. And if we put something out that people don't like, that's always really, that's very nerve-wracking. And that's a universal writerly creative experience. But if you're nervous about sharing something before you're ready to share it, I think it's okay to hold that back and to say, maybe not yet. I'm not ready for this yet. From my personal experience, I came out before I was ready because I was publishing and I felt like I had to. And I don't like that that's part of my story. I'm sad about that because I wish that I'd had more time to digest my identity and kind of figure out how I wanted to talk about it. And as a result of that, I have come out so many times because I continue to discover new things about myself, and there's no end in sight for that process. So I do think that there's a certain amount of, if you're worried about it because you're not sure you have your labels exactly right, or you're nervous about all that, there are always going to be new things about yourself that you're going to discover. If you're waiting to discover everything before you share it, then you're going to never share it at all. But I think there's a balance there, basically. You have to ask yourself what it is that's making you nervous. And if that thing that's making you nervous is a legitimate fear of retaliation from family who's homophobic, or if it's a fear of your community who might be not supportive or something like that, I think those are valid things to consider, and you should keep yourself safe. But if your nervousness around it is about, more of a publishing or creative anxiety, I would encourage you to go for it.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important thing just to mention as well, that if you're not in a position where you're safe to sort of publish something where it may mean that you're coming out as well, then definitely consider that and don't feel pressured into that, because of course you have to almost be in a privileged position to be able to have that safety and not worry about sort of potential backlash from individuals, organizations, groups, that sort of thing. I know when I wrote my short story, I was more nervous on like the personal sort of like internal level, like do I want to reveal all of this to like family and friends? And for a long time I held back on showing the story to anyone, but then like I was also quite proud of it because it was the first verse narrative that I'd written as well, and I just like really fell in love with that form. And I showed it to my agent and she really liked it as well. And I was like, okay, I want to try and like find some way that we can get this published. And that is where the idea for the anthology being Ace came from. So I am really pleased right now that I did like decide to go forward with trying to get that story out there, because it meant that we could also get all of our narratives out there as well in these short stories and produce this whole anthology. So yeah, I mean, it does have benefits of doing that, but of course we have to be in a position where it is safe for us to do so.
I do want to say, could I just add something? I do want to say, though, that if you are in a position where you can't really express yourself honestly because there might be repercussions, like because of where you live and the laws in that particular area, I do feel like writing fiction is great in that it allows you to explore things without necessarily openly coming out as anything. It's so important, and it's a lifeline to so many young people. I'm from Singapore, where only recently a very homophobic law that left over from the English was repealed. It's called 377A. This was repealed like last year. So, I mean, we all come from all kinds of backgrounds, and it is a position of privilege to be out and proud and to be able to write about. But some of us have to not do that. We can't. We literally, it's not safe for us. And if that's the kind of position you're writing from, I do feel that it's still important for you to have a voice. Other people should not be speaking for you just because of where you live. You can still speak for yourself. But if the safety of fiction allows you to do so, then by all means, write the fiction. You don't have to come out. You do not owe the coming out to anyone, because you are the one who bears the repercussions of coming out. And sometimes they are legal. You know what I mean? Yeah. I just have to say that because of where I'm from.
Yeah, I mean, that is such an important point, so thank you so much for bringing that up. Is there anything that anyone else would like to add now that we're at this point as well?
Well, if we have time to tear something apart, I saw this post earlier that was talking about the unsaleable ace, the type of character and the false notion that someone is only sufficiently ace if they are not disabled or autistic or elderly or transgender, they have no history of trauma, nothing else supposedly explain away why they don't experience sexual attraction. And the idea that we can't yet have ace characters with big flaws, because if they have flaws, then maybe their asexuality isn't part of their identity, but something else entirely. And I think it was really interesting because how careful we have had to be when we crafted the characters for our anthology. As we said, we had to avoid these massive tropes that we can't explore because, well, we explored the opposite because we wanted to tear them down. But the whole idea that our characters had to be the best ace characters, because otherwise they're going to be, it's not going to be enough. And I don't think we have time to discuss this whole, because it's a whole mess.
This is the problem when there's just not enough representation.
Exactly.
The one representation has to be the perfect one. It's horrible, regardless of what kind of minority you are.
Yeah, when are we going to reach that point where we can have ace characters from all over? We can have big ace villains, too. I want a good ace villain,
Oh, yes, please.
Yes. I hope that we're going to reach that point soon, that we can write all the facets of ace characters.
Yeah, and like if you are ace because of trauma, you're still ace. I mean, you're not suddenly not ace because there's some other, like reason why. It's still valid.
I would also argue, like, I think there is and this isn't everyone, but the idea of being ace because of trauma, I think that there is often a like confusion around that, and that sometimes you are ace and you have trauma, and that there is ace people experience, according to a lot of surveys that I've seen and research has been done, they do experience a lot of corrective sexual abuse. And that's something that does happen to ace people. And just because you have that trauma and that trauma intersects with your identity doesn't mean the trauma is the reason for the identity. You might have had the identity before and never really been required to interact with it until you experienced a trauma. And suddenly you're like, this is now at the forefront of my immediate needs. And now I don't know how these interact. So I think that that's something that's often comes up, is this idea of abuse or trauma of some kind being the cause of asexuality, rather than simply, unfortunately, just a common occurrence because of that corrective, heteronormative kind of society we live in. And I think it's not always a because situation. So it's, there's a lot of logical fallacies within that, but it's not always related in that exact way.
Yeah. We're all complicated people. Every ace is a different person with a different story.
Yeah.
And such a life. And I can't wait for us to have the opportunities to write characters who have those kinds of complicated lives without them being tied to tropes that are repeated.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, we are now at the end of this. So I'm going to invite ER back onto the stage. Thank you so much for such and just hear your thoughts on asexuality and what we're doing with this anthology.
Thank you so much. I love this, and I know our community is going to really love and appreciate it. I want to encourage everyone who's here tonight. If you don't yet have a copy of Being Ace, you can click this teal button at the bottom. It's actually a long banner at the bottom because it's kind of a long subtitle. And by Being Ace, an anthology of queer, trans, femme, and disabled stories of asexual love and connection from Charis Books and More. It really does help us when you buy your books from us. So thank you. We know that some of our viewers are in the UK. So this is you can only buy it from us in the US, but there are many great UK retailers who are also selling the books. So please buy the book from an indie in the UK and or wherever your home country is. And we will be adding this event to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Charis Circle in just a few days. So if there's anybody who would have really loved this conversation but wasn't here tonight, just be on the lookout for that and share it on your socials and let them know, like, hey, this is another great conversation. I think, again, we're in this moment of, talking about ace representation in media a little bit more than I've ever seen in my lifetime. And, people being either disappointed or kind of happy or, having critiques around various things. But people are talking, and that's great. So it's a great time to share this event. And finally, encourage your local public library, if you live in the United States, to carry this book. We really want young people to have access to this book. We want people of all ages to have access to this book, but especially young people at a time when schools are doing some silent banning of books. People are preemptively pulling books off the shelf. It's all the more important that we get books like this into public libraries so that young people can have access to them. So the best way to do that is to just request it from the library. We hear all the time that librarians want the political will from the people to do that. So don't be shy. Ask for what you want and what you need, and hopefully more people will join you in that. So thank you all so much for a beautiful evening. I hope you stay safe and well, and maybe we'll get to see you in person at Charis one day. But until next time, take care. Thank you.